Welcome and good morning, everyone. This is the Moving People Forward keynote session, Road to Reparations, Race and Reckoning Through Mobility Policy. I'm Piep Van Heuven, Director of Government Relations at Bicycle Colorado. We're going to start today by introducing our interpreters. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Community Language Cooperative for their instructions on Spanish, Vietnamese, and also ASL interpretation.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Indira Guzman, and I'm here with the Community Language Co-op. This morning, the organizers of this event have made a commitment to language justice. What that means is that we want everyone to participate and engage in the language of their heart. So we're going to have a simultaneous interpretation available for today. We will be interpreting into Spanish, Vietnamese, English, and ASL. In a second, we're going to give the instructions in Spanish and in Vietnamese. So in a second, we're going to turn on interpretation. You will see an icon on the bottom of the screen that says interpretation. You won't see it yet. We will turn it on after we say the announcement in all the languages. Click the icon and select the language that you prefer to engage in. Please select we're going to have the 3 languages, so please select the language that you prefer. I'm going to repeat this now in español. Buenos días, mi nombre es Indira Guzmán y estoy aquí con la Community Language Co-op. Esta mañana los organizadores de este evento han hecho un compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje. Lo que esto significa es que queremos que todos participen en el idioma de su corazón. Para esto vamos a usar la interpretación simultánea. Tendremos interpretación en inglés, en español, en vietnamés y en ASL. Si tiene alguna pregunta, por favor, mándenos un chat. Voy a dar lugar a Father Joseph Dang, que es el del anuncio en vietnamés. I will now let Father Joseph Dang make the announcement in Vietnamese.
Xin kính chào quý vị, tôi là Linh Mục Joseph Đặng Xuân Tùng, là một người thành viên của Community Language Cooperative. Thì hôm nay chúng tôi sẽ cũng như là dịch cho quý vị và ngôn ngữ của công lý. Lý do là tại sao là chúng ta để được nghe thông thạo bằng tiếng Việt Nam là ngôn ngữ trong trái tim của chúng ta, để cho ngày hôm nay chúng tôi sẽ có như phần thâm dịch của tiếng Tây Ban Nha, tiếng Việt và cũng như tiếng của những người bị câm điếc. Khi mà họ nói chuyện xong thì chúng tôi sẽ dịch lại bằng tiếng Việt hoặc cũng như là tiếng Tây Ban Nha. Sau khi họ nói xong thì họ sẽ mở lên cái phần ngôn ngữ đó để cho quý vị vô và quý vị nghe trực tiếp. Thank you.
Please turn on interpretation.
Welcome back. We're going to get started with a few housekeeping instructions. Please be sure that your video and audio are off for the presentation this morning. We encourage you to use the chat function to communicate with each other, to say hello, to make comments. You'll be using the Q&A function to ask questions during the Q&A portion of the session, and we'll also be monitoring the chat for comments or questions to pass on to the moderator. At Moving People Forward, we must not only talk about the future, but also acknowledge the past. Our team would like to reserve space this morning to recognize and honor the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations, who were the original occupants and custodians of this land for centuries before ethnic cleansing led by white settlers. We are grateful to these communities, their living descendants in Colorado and descendants of those forcibly relocated here, for their wisdom and resilience in both the past and present. It's critical that we keep in mind the connections between transportation and these American Indian communities. Everyone in this room travels and recreates on stolen lands. Many of us choose how we get around and the impact we have on the land. And many of us also make decisions on transportation systems and how land is used that further influence our community's footprint. And while our fields often discuss freedom of mobility, we must also acknowledge the right for people to stay in place that was taken from American Indians by colonizers. Thank you for honoring these people and their land with us this morning. We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors that support our programs. Our 2021 Moving People Forward series sponsor is Lyft. And today's session is brought to you by St. Joseph's Hospital. St. Joseph's Hospital was founded in Denver in 1873 by the Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth as the first private teaching hospital in Colorado. Today, it remains the largest private teaching hospital in Denver.
We learn new things, help a neighbor. We're all doing more for each other today, for a healthy tomorrow. Because a little thing can be a big thing, like a video visit with your doctor to feel better. At SCL Health, we're providing more options for care in more convenient ways, so you don't have to put off your health, and that feels good.
Welcome back. Here are some norms that we'd like to ask you to observe during today's session. Please be present and actively listen. Generously share your thoughts, ideas, and questions in the chat. Assume best intentions of each other. Challenge your assumptions. Seek to understand new, different, or constructive perspectives. Expect and accept non-closure. Lean into discomfort and hold yourself and each other accountable to these norms. I'm now happy to introduce the Moving People Forward keynote session, Road to Reparations, Race and Reckoning Through Mobility Policy. In a minute, you'll hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Destiny Thomas of the Thrivance Group. Today's moderator will be Mike Washington. He's the Director of Denver Metro Outreach, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for U.S. Senator Michael Bennet. And now to start every MPF session, we'll have a community member who will share how statewide and local policies impact their lived experience. Our storytellers help make the work that we do more tangible and real. We hope the knowledge they share will help us be more inclusive and equitable in our work and lives and inspire us to lift up the human impacts of our work in transportation. This morning, we're going to hear from Amar Azucena Sid from Oak Park, Sacramento.
My name is Amara Susana Sid. I am in Sacramento, California. I'm a transportation planner, born and raised in a neighborhood called Oak Park. It wasn't always easy to live in this neighborhood. It was never easy to defend where I was from, and sometimes I didn't always want to. It was rough growing up here. It was pretty violent at times. There was a lot of crime. There was a lot of gangings. There was heavy police enforcement in this neighborhood. We didn't have a grocery store until I was about 19, within like a 2-mile radius, but it was home. It was where I was raised. It kind of gave me this lens of how our planning industry has purposely disinvested in Black and brown communities. Oak Park at one time was a thriving Black community with a pretty good business district. It had a trolley system, and then our freeway systems came in and destroyed that business district, cut out the trolleys. The trolleys were removed. There was no longer, public transit into downtown Sacramento for quite some time. And I think about how our racist policies within this industry have harmed our Black community members for generations, and the perpetual violence that has created within our Black and brown communities is indicative of our complacency within this industry. I think about Oak Park as it's changing, as many Black and brown communities are changing throughout the United States, are heavily impacted with gentrification, with new folks coming in, more affluent white community members coming in, and seeing the desirability and the accessibility of our neighborhoods. Oak Park is only 3 miles from the state capitol, where there's a lot of jobs, a lot of state jobs. We're positioned right next to the UC Davis Medical Center, where in the last 15 years has really made waves in the medical industry and technology sector. I'm fortunate to live here. I don't have to travel far to my work. I can ride a bike, I can walk, I can take transit, I can drive in, but I don't have to get on the freeway. And I now have access to new restaurants, to some $15 smoothies if that's what I want to get into. But I don't see the majority of this neighborhood that once was having the same opportunities to enjoy those benefits. As a transportation planner and as an Indigenous person, as a Chicana, I wholeheartedly agree that we need to atone for our racist policies that have really decimated Black and brown communities. I would imagine that as we keep talking about equity and mobility justice, that we're really going to start putting the investment dollars needed to atone for the harms that have taken shape. What does investment look like without a guarantee that the investment will benefit Black community members? When we talk about reparations in this industry, people don't see a connection, and I see a way for all of us to atone and support our Black brothers and sisters, especially in 2021, when we're seeing the rate of harm in our public right of way. You know, how are we as community members, as planners, not actively addressing the long-time generational harm that our industry is part of?
All right, welcome back, folks. We are just taking a quick look at whether we can run that video again. If you could hold on for a minute. We do apologize for the technical issues. And thanks again for holding on while we take a look at that video option. Now might be a great time to introduce yourself to the other panelists in the chat. I see that the folks from Colorado Springs have already begun that. Thanks. Thanks again for holding on. We should be back to you in just a few minutes here. All right, I think what we're going to do is to move forward with the panel session. In just a moment, you are going to hear from moderator Mike Washington.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm Mike Washington. I'll be your moderator today, and I have the distinguished pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. She's the founder of and the CEO of the Thrivance Group, which is a group that is a multi-regional, socially responsible, for-profit firm that works to make public spaces and public services more safe, more healthy, and more accessible, especially for Black, Indigenous, and transgender people and those with disabilities. Dr. Thomas is one of the most amazing speakers that we could have at an event like this. She's one of the most forward-thinking planners that I've met. And I'm so glad that she's come into this space and is actually perpetuating this message that people don't get to hear much in the whole realm of urban planning and the urbanist movement. And that's why I'm so glad and honored to be able to actually introduce her today. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce you all to Dr. Destiny Thomas. And by the way, an important fact, if you really want to get on her good side, you need to give her dumplings or ramen. But if you really want to get on her good side, you got to give her cookies. She said that she could live off of cookies, and that is one of the most important facts about Dr. Destiny Thomas. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Destiny Thomas, please.
Good morning, Mike, and good morning, everyone. Mike, I told Mike I'm a shy person. Now I'm over here blushing and nervous about everyone knowing my obsession with cookies. So thanks so much for that. I'm so happy to be here with you all this morning for a number of reasons. One is because I had a pretty wild 2021. Much like other folks as well. Hold on, let me give you full screen. Much like other folks, but I did experience my own personal bout with COVID-19, and also recently lost my uncle. And so more and more each day, I'm excited to be alive and to have literal breath in my body. Those of you who saw me speak toward the end of last year know that it was a struggle for me to get through more than 5 minutes of speaking without being winded. So please bear with me if that happens today. I'm still recovering, but again, happy to use my body and my energy to do what I feel I'm called to do in this space. Today, I want to share with you about my idea for a road to reparations. At the Thrive-Ins group, we call this CPRU. It is our comprehensive package for reparations through urbanism. And simply put, we feel it is long overdue time for us as a sector to really take a close look at how the legacy of slavery, how the legacy of racism, and how ongoing harm can be not just mitigated, but resolved, how we can bring healing through our work, how we can bring atonement through our work, and how we can start to reimagine the work of community planning and city planning beyond some of the motives and intentions that got us to where we are today. So I think now is a great time, namely because of the transition in political leadership that we're going through. And I know that there's much talk about the removal of highways, although many states are considering expanding and widening their highway system. So I don't know how this is gonna pan out. But I think in all of these discussions, it's important for us to remember that before we can truly innovate and take a collective step forward, we have to acknowledge and think about what came before. So reparations has many, many meanings to many people. Even within our own organization, we have had some conflict about how we would define reparations and for whom. I want to thank my great friend, Amara Asusena, for the video that she took the time to make, her and her family took the time to make for us. I'll do my best to make sure for those of you who want to see it the way it was prepared to share it with you. But she is a colleague that I often go to sort of have as a thought partner on concepts like our CPRU work. And I thought it was important to tap her as the storyteller for this keynote. One, because she is also amazing in changing the landscape of planning as we know it in the state of California. But two, because I think that she is someone in my life that exemplifies the type of cross-community, cross-cultural engagement, thought partnership, really progress that I think is possible across this country, not in an ornamental rainbow coalition-esque kind of way, but in a way that really lifts up and acknowledges both the unity and the distinction in our lived experiences. So for the purposes of our time today, how I would like to offer our notion of reparations is that we're talking about acknowledging what has happened and what is continuing to happen. We are talking about restitution, and while my solutions are situated in a comprehensive package for reparations in the built environment, we know that that will probably definitely be only one aspect of atonement that needs to happen. I am in favor of cutting the check. We're also going to be talking about what it means to repair past harms, and also reparations for what, right? And for me, that includes all forms of state-sanctioned slavery, including more recently ICE detention centers across the West Coast, but across the country really, and thinking about of course, our brothers and sisters who are detained, who come from directly south of the border, but the many Black bodies that are literally invisible and going uncounted in those same institutions. And we're also talking about what we mean in terms of who the beneficiaries of slavery are. We hear people who are not in agreement with reparations often point out nobody who was actually involved in slavery is still living. We can't atone for what our ancestors have done. We can only move forward. First of all, it's not true. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But second of all, of course we can. Where our work in climate justice is about atoning for the harms that we've caused over time to the land, right? And so we already have a framework and a way to hold in our minds the importance and the value of this type of act of going back and repairing what we've done. Specifically for the Thrivance Group, our work toward reparations centers and focuses on Black people in the United States, especially descendants of slavery, but we also recognize that people who live in bodies that are marked as Black and are racialized as Black in this country also experience the legacy and impacts of slavery, whether they are born and raised in the United States or not. So we include the diaspora in our understanding of reparations at the Thrivance Group. So why is it important for us to talk about slavery and reparations in a conversation about mobility, right? And mobility justice, if you're feeling fancy. This is important because the literal health and psychological impacts of bondage have not left us. So I want to share with you the American Psychological Association's sort of overview of what the longstanding impacts of being kidnapped are. And I'm sharing this because what should come to mind for you as you read the screen and as I read some of these things to you is that these are a lot of the things that we're dealing with, especially in the Black community today. Even when we think about the reluctance and the apathy that many Black people have regarding the COVID-19 vaccinations, right? We see a lot of banter on social media where folks are, calling people out of their names and calling them unintelligent and really being judgmental about their fear of the system. But we can't forget where these ideas and where these ideals come from. And I think how this connects to our work in the various mobility spaces is that same harm, that same distrust, those same impacts show up on us as we navigate the built environment, regardless of what mode we're using, right? And so the three common areas where we see these impacts show up are in a person's thinking, in a person's emotions, and in a person's interactions, right? And so I'm not gonna read this whole list, but some of the things that I want you to focus on for this conversation are when you are out of bondage, when you are freed from a captor, you fear the likelihood of captivity for the rest of your life. You live in fear of that event happening again. And it's important, again, going back to the assumption that nobody who's experienced slavery in the United States is still living. Although that is not true, what is true is that this fear that literally is embedded in our DNA, spans generations, right? So it stays with us for generations. And we are reared to understand that there is a type of vigilance and fear, Black people, that we need to have, both in public, but also in other spaces where our captor or the state really is in play. Another impact is emotions. And what I want to focus on here is sense of hopelessness, guilt, and anxiety, right? We talk about imposter syndrome a lot in Black spaces, especially when we're mentoring young folks who are emerging practitioners. And this idea that, being one of very few who made it out of, your hood or maybe some intra-family trauma that has happened, you really, even though you have, moved beyond the immediate harm, you still live with guilt that you made it out and others didn't. And that ties into having a sense of hopelessness. And I often hear planners talking about or asking why it's so hard to reach certain communities. We even saw the federal government come up with a whole category for the census called hard to reach populations. And there are some very easy to measure, easy to track, easy to justify connections to our emotions toward the state and toward the agencies that serve us. And then lastly, our interactions are impacted. Of course, how we interact with one another are impacted. But one of the other common discussions in planning and mobility planning centers around the need to do more in community engagement and to do better community engagement. But we haven't done the work of healing and atoning for how slavery has impacted our ability to simply connect, right? And then lastly, survivors of bondage often develop an unconscious bond to their captors and experience grief if their captors are harmed, and sometimes feel guilty for developing that bond. We have a complicated relationship, Black folks, with the United States. I myself have had to really grow up in my understanding about how I can be in service of other people in the United States while not abandoning what I think is an important call to action or an important assertion that there's atonement to be made, right? And so being an American living in the United States while also holding and acknowledging that I am not here because one of my ancestors chose for us to be here is something that I would probably grapple with my entire life. And I'm sure if I choose to have children, will be a challenge for them too. One of the ways I have been able to move through, not yet beyond, but one of the ways I've been able to move through these nuances is through my love of the outdoors, particularly as home has been a place of contention for me my whole life. Not that I had an incredibly negative upbringing, but just because of some of the social challenges that we encountered growing up, like what Amar talked about in her video, home is always in flux, right? I can't necessarily name a certain city or a certain building or a sort of type of structure my home, right? Because I haven't had the privilege of being in one place consistently. And so oftentimes when I'm trying to, share with other planners, like through our Dignity Institute, ideas about how to engage people more meaningfully, I talk about this notion of home and how our work has been really disruptive to people in this way. And James Baldwin, I always forget the title of the book, but I know the chapter. I know there's an excerpt in his book where he talks about, it's a fictional character, but he talks about what it was like being a queer person in the rural South, and his queer identity not being able to be his identity, right? Living in the rural South, he could only be a Black person and could only be subject to the injustices, the disparity, the racism, because he was Black. And so navigating that meant he could not explore, express, or assert any other aspect of his identity, right? And so he visits France for the first time, and there's this monologue or this internal dialogue that he's having where he, for the first time, has fixed his gaze on another man, and he's really excited. He's attracted to him. And in his reflection of that moment, he talks about how it feels to be able to sit and live in that sentiment openly in the built environment in public, without fear of being killed or attacked from it, right? So this is his first time being able to sit in an aspect of his identity other than his Blackness. And while he is sitting in that, something in him reminds him that he has to be vigilant, that he is in public. And the thing that calls him back is his Blackness, right? And so he sums up this whole moment by saying, perhaps home is not a place, but simply an irrevocable condition. And this is a quote that resonates with me deeply because it's so true. No matter how my conditions have improved, no matter where I move, no matter who I live next to, no matter what amenities I have access to, the trauma and the harm that I've encountered at home, right, little lowercase h, home, in society, doesn't go away once you improve my conditions, right? We still have to put focus on the impact of what I've lived through. And maybe that condition is irrevocable, and maybe those feelings never go away. So the expectation would be that society evolve to accommodate the fact that I'm in this condition. The picture here on the screen is of my mommy. She's the little girl with the bow in her hair. While we were doing some work to make arrangements for my uncle who passed away, we came across this photo, and it is now one of my favorite photos because it's a picture of my mom and her siblings outside, playing outside on the family farm after church one Sunday. And even though this photo is grainy and black and white and, really tight and close up, it was funny because as soon as I saw it, I said, "Mom, I visited this farm." And she said, "Destiny, how do you know where we are?" And I could name the city and everything just by looking at this patch of grass behind them. And when I was in college, I visited our farm in Elizabeth City, which my family owns. No one has maintained the land, so the cotton field is still growing out of control there. But I remember being in college and visiting that place and feeling a special connection to the land and thinking about my relationship to the outdoors, and how my love for the outdoors has been forged in fire by the ancestors that came before me. So I wanted to share this picture with you of my irrevocable condition, and to share with you that while we are speaking about reparations, there's room in this conversation to hold both joy and sadness. And I think that our solutions in the mobility space need to encompass both as well. One of the other common things that come up in conversations about reparations is, look how far we've come, right? We're not there yet. We haven't done enough. Or sometimes in interviews, people will ask me, well, what about the progress that you saw happen in 2020? How do you feel about that? And this is how I feel. I feel like asking me to be excited about a very fractional portion on a continuum of time of what other people perceive to be freedom and liberation, while knowing that my condition is the result of hundreds of years of intentional harm to the bodies of my ancestors and those who look like me and are also from the continent of Africa. No, I don't feel good, right? And no, we're not there yet. Actually, we are here over on the far right of this spectrum, but I want us to focus on what is that, right? What is that green spot on the right-hand side? Why is it green? What are we suggesting? Are we suggesting that we're no longer enslaved? Are we suggesting that we're no longer segregated? Are we suggesting that we're no longer subject to the impacts of slavery? So I want to talk about that green area a little bit. So this spectrum has us entering the green area right at 1954. So in 1960 in Colorado, y'all know, you don't need me to tell you your own history, but I thought it was pretty cool when I looked it up myself. I found Lincoln Hills, and I found the story of Lincoln Hills and how this was, this photo reminded me of the photo of my mom that I just showed you. How this was an area that Black folks would go to be in community, and they would go camping, and they would have access to all types of beautiful recreation. And it soon became a place that Black people migrated to from less so-called progressive regions of the country in order to simply live in peace. But I want you to focus on the text here on the screen that is in bold, where it says, as African Americans enjoyed access to an increasing variety of mountain recreational parks, hotels, and motels, the lure of Lincoln Hills continued to fade, right? And, you know, this is the saga that most Black communities have gone through in this country. Why does the lure of our communities, the place that we've built and added cultural value to, fade? And that's for a number of reasons, because even at so-called home, we are under attack, right? So that's reason number one. But also even our construct and understanding of land and spatial value, even when there are features like recreation, and I'm sure there was some version of mobility here, we still don't value it. And it's because we don't value Black people. And I thought that this was an important point to make, because in a lot of our solutions, we bring up, well, if we introduce more parks, if we add more bicycle facilities, this problem gets easier to solve. It's not necessarily the case. And again, this is just context setting. Of course, I can't go through a whole timeline in 30 minutes. But then in 1970, we started to see Black and brown folks, definitely in Colorado, but all over the country, working together because to challenge the disparity that existed, racial disparities that existed in economic, access to the economy between Black people and white people, brown people and white people, and even Black and brown people. So in the 70s, we saw a very beautiful movement happening across the West Coast and in Colorado. Does Colorado consider itself the West Coast? Anyway, if you listen to E40 in Colorado, then you're part of the West Coast. But we saw a beautiful convergence of communities happening in the name of social justice. And we got the introduction of several housing programs prior to that. But when Nixon came in, he slashed HUD by 50%, right? So where we could have been much farther along in our conversation about reparations and atonement, we also had the highest leaders of our country, the highest ranking leaders of our country, actively working to undermine that. If you haven't heard or listened to the Nixon tapes, I encourage you all to Google them if they're still available on Google, because it's important. I know that the moment we're in now with the president we just got done with, we're shocked and we're appalled and we can't believe this is happening. And this has always happened. These men have been responsible for making most, if not all, of the decisions that have led to us being within the grip of harm that we're in. Similarly, Ronald Reagan, who, because of our recent president, most people have forgot is problematic, really contributed to skyrocketing rates of incarceration across the country, but definitely in Colorado, right? So in Colorado, between 1980 and 1997, we see that the number of people behind bars for non-violent drug offenses rapidly skyrocketed. And how the war on drugs was enacted was by really attacking, stalking, and abusing Black bodies in the built environment. In the 1980s, President Clinton added his fingerprints to the mess by introducing a zero-tolerance housing policy. Actually, this was in 1996, it's mislabeled. But he implemented a zero-tolerance housing policy, which basically really started us on the trajectory that we continue to be on when it comes to rampant houselessness, especially on the West Coast. In the 2000s, in Denver, actually, we saw an increase of no-knock raids, whereby judges would only reject 5 of the 106 no-knock raids just in the year 2000 alone. And then conversation that's been happening across the country, but definitely on the West Coast, is the incorporation or the exploitation of labor of enslaved or incarcerated people for literal pennies per day, forcing them to fight wildfires and fires stemming from chemical combustion as well. In 2018, we saw the state of Colorado remove the exemption for slavery finally from their state constitution, which up until 2018 said that the state prohibited slavery except as a punishment for crime, right? In 2020, we found during the George Floyd protests, and I'm bringing this up because sometimes the leaders of the elected officials like to point out the progress that's been made in Colorado as well as in other West Coast states, and the progress toward police reform. But we saw that even during protests where we were advocating for police reform, police officers were excessively violent and failed to use the mechanisms set forth by law to keep us safe. What does all of this have to do with mobility? Mobility, our various modes of transportation have been the investments that got us to many of the disparities that I just went through, right? The grandfather of state-sanctioned slavery in this country is railroads, where the purpose of railroads originally was literally for the transport of Black bodies as cargo. They forced us to build the railroads and then sold us on them. Here's a list of atrocities that we don't have time to go through today that I would like you to screenshot. Because when we ask the question of, excuse my puppy in the background, when we ask the question of what does all of this have to do with mobility, it's important for us to remember who invested in slavery, who invested in the degradation of housing and access to housing for Black people. It was the transportation field, starting as early as the slave ships in the transatlantic slave trade, the Fugitive Slave Acts, which literally created what we now call police, but which were formerly called slave patrols, solely enacted for the purpose of preventing the mobility of Black bodies, even those who were so-called free. We saw segregated transit. school busing, which continues to be a violent act of segregation in many communities. We saw the centering of white comfort show up as the highway system was created simply for white people to have access to the city center while living far away from the undesirable Black and brown bodies in the urban center. This is how we came up with suburbanism. Of course, policing continues to be an issue. Carlessness is still being defined as a poverty construct in all of our metrics and our data regarding mobility, and so on and so forth. But what I want us to focus on in the moment that we're in now is that the likelihood that as we step into this conversation about resolving climate change, even our green solutions, the burden of implementing them will more likely than not be on Black bodies. So I want you to see this before I close. I want you to see this timeline again. I want you to understand that no, we are not there yet. And what this timeline is showing us is that even though we've made what we think is progress, that through our innovation, mobility innovation, most of the harmful acts that are causing trauma for Black and brown communities, actually, we began enacting them in 1954 in our green era. Also take a screenshot of this. I'm definitely not going to go through this, but I just wanted to have come with my receipts today. There are many lists on the internet of corporations and companies who have invested in slavery and continue to benefit from slavery. These are some of them. I didn't want to offend anyone today, but I actually personally have a list of urban planning firms and transportation planning firms that continue to benefit from state-sanctioned slavery today as we speak. If anyone would like that list, feel free to email me. I say all this to say that we have a really, really strong case for a comprehensive package for reparations through urbanism. And while we won't be able to go through what that looks like today, I wanted to share with you that one place we could start for at least looking for ideas is to revisit the APA's description of what happens to a person when they experience bondage. The same remedies that they offer here could show up in the built environment. Access to medical attention, improving safety and security in a way that the person themselves would define as safe, making sure people are able to connect with their loved ones, improving and increasing opportunities to talk about their experience, a different kind of engagement. Of course, the distribution of resources and harm reductive activities, protecting people's privacy, so moving away from surveillance, and taking time, right? Giving people time just to adjust to the changes that we're suggesting they make. I want to thank you for inviting me to this talk. I know I've gone slightly over time, but looking forward to the Q&A session with you, Mike.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. That was amazing. And I really appreciate the amount of attention and love you gave to, the great James Baldwin. I mean, I recall him in his debate at Oxford, right, where he was just talking about, my countrymen, and how could my countrymen, the people that I walk, beside and help and so on and so forth, how could they do this to me? And just the conflict that we have here in America, this constant tension where we, idolize and talk about freedom, but it's always been for some, not all. And it's just great it was a great thing for you to bring up. We got a couple of questions that are coming in. I want to prioritize the questions from our participants and our attendees rather. So the first one comes from Drew Parker. Drew says, Dr. Thomas, where do you think it's best to advocate for reparations? And at the local, state, federal level, private businesses, all of the above?
Yeah, so this is something that we're actually at the end of this month, at the end of Black History Month, because we're corny like that. We'll be actually sharing a 1-page or 2-page probably outline of this type of recommendation. But yeah, it's at all levels. I think it's important for us as advocates to understand what our role will be in reparations. Unfortunately, we'll have to be active participants in the healing process. So those of us on the ground, communities, definitely reparations is something I see as a community-based planning exercise or policy creating exercise. I think that there are some things that only local municipal agencies can decide to do, and actually don't take as much head time or lead time to implement. We can see reparations tomorrow if the local Department of Transportation wanted us to. But then all of this has to be supported both by state interventions as well as federal legislation to hold us accountable for the spirit of the work, of course. But I see this as an important localized effort for sure.
Got it. Got it. Got another question for you. What parallels can we draw from the insurrection on January 6th and standard urban planning? I mean, because I think what you've been doing is very interesting, and we haven't seen done in this field much, where we're all talking about, you know, racism and kind of keep, you know, transportation, you know, like we hold it harmless, to, you know, so to speak. But these parallels are harder to draw. Can you do that for us?
Yeah, this this could be a whole keynote, this question. But tons of parallels, right? The first one that was obvious to me that I kind of laughed at was, you know, there's suspicion around which elected officials kind of helped do recon efforts before the actual insurrection happened. And I think in planning, we see that too. We see the people who have access to power in our planning processes circling up with the members of the community that they want to be in community with, and circling up with people that they want, whose power they also want to access, and creating the rules of the game. Excuse my puppy once again. And creating the rules of engagement before anyone has an opportunity to participate in a civic engagement process. So I thought that there was some irony to giving the insurrectionists access to the building beforehand while actively working to keep people like BLM out of it. I also, of course, another obvious one was the way that act was policed. I don't know if you're not a Black person, I don't know if you could really wrap your head around what it's like to constantly know that so many people around you are suspicious of you just because your body is visible in public. This is not an exaggeration. I learned really young, at the age of 4, my mom teases me about it. I learned really, really young that people are just innately suspicious of me when I walk into an open space. What are you doing here? What do you want? And to see white supremacists converge online for weeks, talk about what they're gonna do, show up to do it, and folks still act like they're surprised that they showed up. Like everyone is so worried about how Black people will respond. Some would argue that it would be a righteous response, but some of us are so worried about how Black people will respond, but have no energy or no accountability for those, you know, white folks who live a more privileged life. So I thought that there was some irony to that. And then lastly, I'll just say entitlement to space in general. We saw this with the mask debate. No, I won't go home. No, I won't wear a mask. Really temper tantrums. The entitlement to space. I belong here. I have a right to be here. This is our building. These are our steps. We pay for this. And how reluctant even I myself, with my own current understanding of these issues, would really struggle to show up with that kind of sense of entitlement. It's wild. It really is.
Yeah. That reminds me of when one of the Fox newscasters was out, you know, just trying to interview some of the people that weren't actively, you know, trying to enter the Capitol, saying, "Hey, how do you feel about this? I mean, aren't you concerned?" And he was like, "Concerned? That's the people's house.
Yeah.
That's our house." So yeah, that entitlement factor is very real. I appreciate you.
They have an irrevocable condition too.
Mm-hmm.
That is their house.
Mm-hmm.
That is their house. It's not ours. It isn't. So we can't walk up in there with that kind of energy.
Can't even walk down the street with it.
No.
But anyway.
Nowhere in this country is a Black person truly at home.
See,
my therapist would hate that I just said that, but it's the truth.
Man, see, I'm gonna have to bring out the Oregon for Dr. Thomas, y'all. She's up here in the pulpit getting it. Another question for you, I think, is very appropriate for this audience. Does adding bike lanes in communities of color help or hurt past injustices?
I think that is not a productive way to look at the issue. I don't think the infrastructure, this is actually my problem with planning, transportation planning entirely. We talk about cars, we talk about roadways, we even talk about bus stops, but we don't talk about people, right? And so it's not that the bike lane is an inherently evil object, this innate thing is ruining and ravaging neighborhoods. No, it's the process by which those bike lanes show up that definitely ruin and ravage neighborhoods. And what we signal when we implement bike lanes the way that we do, usually through an expedited process or through a process that privileges affluent people, not always white people, usually elders too, privileges those folks and their voice. It signals, one, for other people to move in and reproduce that dynamic of entitlement, but it also signals the people who are currently there that that they're not home and that they don't have a say.
Yep. So another question for you. Does atonement look different in every community, or are there universal principles that can be implemented?
Both. We will be sharing universal privileges at the well, maybe that too. We will be sharing universal principles at the end of this month. We'll share it on social media as well as on our website. We think that that is the baseline by which we should begin to think about reparations and atonement spatially. But we also will be sharing guidelines for how to evolve those concepts in a local context, depending on geographic typology. So it's the answer to that is both, but there's a baseline. I shared some of those in the op-ed that I wrote for Streets blog about reparations in the built environment last year.
Yeah, okay, cool. We'll be looking forward to that. Another one for you. What role does the developer community play in the unurbanist movement? I mean, we know that that's the, one of the hands that rocks the cradle, so to speak. So yeah, please tell us how it is that they can actually jump in.
Yeah, in the unurbanist movement, I think that sometimes when me and my personal friend circle love to talk about to capitalist or to not capitalist, this comes up for me. And I think that the reality is this. When we're speaking about Black people, it's important for us to understand, yes, capitalism has been really harmful to us, but we have been economists. We've had economy before capitalism was a thing, right? So it's developers have an opportunity to establish a new culture for doing their work, or to return to maybe the cultures that align with who lives in the communities that they want to build and develop in. They have an opportunity to take on new models for development as acts of atonement. And I actually think we need them to do that. One of the ways that I think developers could be helpful is to take on more projects that are community owned. right? So these are the land trust projects. These are the CLTs. These are projects like mobility hub co-ops, cooperative mobility hubs, especially as we start to think about the autonomous vehicle infrastructure. I think there is a business case to be made that hasn't been made for development that's not exploitive and actually putting us on a pathway to decommodifying housing altogether. And by virtue of that, decommodifying mobility and still having a business.
Decommodify housing. Man, I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, especially our fix and flippers in here in Denver.
I mean, let's live with this pandemic another year. They'll change their mind. We're all going to want it soon.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, again, I need an organ. Like we need a sound, like, what is it, a soundboard or whatever. I could just be hitting the horns and the gunshots and all that.
Come on.
All right, I got another one for you.
March to the club just now.
All right, so someone's curious about how high-speed rail ties to systemic racism.
Again, the process. Maybe folks who are listening or watching have heard me say this in the past, but actually my first ever planning job was as an environmental transportation planner. And one of my first projects was California's high-speed rail in the Central Valley. And what I saw was a lot of eminent domain agreements, not necessarily agreement, a lot of eminent domain happen in order to make way for the path that high-speed rail would take. And then I saw an increase in apathy and really distrust and anger with the state as a result of those harmful land use decisions. I got my start in transportation planning in 2007. It is 2021. In case you didn't know, California still doesn't have high-speed rail. So we have erased and displaced two decades worth of families up and down the state of California so that we can do a creative exercise just to imagine what if we had high-speed rail. That would not have been possible in a predominantly white or predominantly high income earning communities. Our practices are inherently racist. And I think the problem is a lot of us are showing up to work, especially in these civil service jobs, and just doing our job and not questioning why this is the job that we're doing.
Yeah, I feel that, having worked for a transit agency myself and, with rail, being on the minds of everyone. I mean, I think people really do get lost in this notion of it really is about how you do what you do. It's not about the asset, on an individual basis. You have to look at these things, more holistically. And are you doing what you can to make these assets valuable to everyone and not just that choice writer?
And if we were to go back to that spectrum, that continuum that was on the slides, that timeline, we've been focusing on long range mobility, like moving people long distances across states, moving cargo, even moving people on 2-3 hour commutes for the last 400 years. When are we going to focus on intra-community connectivity? What if I don't want to leave my neighborhood to go to work? What if I don't want you to get somebody from San Mateo County all the way to Fresno in 15 minutes to come and up the cost of produce in my neighborhood? Like, can we get some Charlies? I like Charlies. Can we get some Charlies locally? Can I own a scooter hub? Can I own a bike share hub, as a resident, especially as we're trying to encourage people to move away from single family housing, which good luck with that. But we need to be able to offer some other way to attain generational wealth, which is the goal that many Black folks have in mind, since that was what was stripped of us for hundreds of years, right? Now we don't, now we think single family houses are bad. My grandparents, my mother has lived her whole life, still living her whole life, seeking an opportunity to purchase a single family home. You know, because our access to wealth has been so, you know, inhibited. And so I think our mobility planning, our transportation planning needs to think about what alternatives we're creating to the commodification of space and land, so that people still have access to that generational stability at least, but generational wealth, definitely.
Right, right. So got another question for you. Do you think the CEQA in California is harmful to communities of color? I.e., do you think environmental review is preventing the state from increasing its amount of affordable housing and transportation in the inner city?
Listen. I know my planning brothers and sisters don't like CEQA. I have an unpopular opinion. It is an informed one, because I just started as an environmental planner. I think, yes, people with access to power and with extra time in their day are using CEQA as a device, or weaponizing CEQA to prevent what we would think are more progressive planning practices, of course. In the absence of CEQA, however, I think things would be much worse for Black and Brown communities. It hasn't done much to serve us, especially from an environmental protection standpoint, because we're still in the neighborhoods that are most prone to environmental toxicity, intentionally planned environmental toxicity. But I think the accountability measures that are included in CEQA for engagement and for public notice, not necessarily engagement, but for public notice and for local accountability, we need to find an alternative way to legislate that before thinking about getting rid of CEQA altogether.
And I forgot to ask you to define CEQA for folks, if you don't mind, really quickly. Just
CEQA is California's state complementary policy to NEPA. CEQA being the California Environmental Quality Act, NEPA being the something about the environment and the act too. That was actually a question in my interview for my first job, and I didn't get it right then either. National Environmental Protection Act. Environmental Policy Act. Okay.
No, we got you. It don't matter.
Is Colorado the West Coast? That's my question to you.
No, we're not the West Coast.
Some people call it the West Coast.
That's because we got a bunch of Californians that live here. Don't listen to them. Like they're attached. They can't admit that they're a part of the Mountain West.
Okay.
They're a part of the Mountain West. All right. Like, it's all right. They just need to let it go.
Okay.
They won't though. I mean, but I listen to E42, you know.
Go ahead and distance yourself from your California cousins. That's fine.
I know. I love California, but this ain't Cali. Like, I go to Cali for Cali. I don't.
Okay.
Come on. All right. Look, I love y'all, but this is Denver, Colorado.
Now I'm clear.
All right.
Okay.
All right. I thought this was a good one too. So related to the process, how can we advocate for improved people-focused, bike ped transit infrastructure in minority communities as largely white advocacy community without coming across as the outsiders pushing our agenda?
Yeah, there are a number of ways to do that. I think if your organization has access to competitive bidding processes, right? If you're able to win those contracts for engagement or even for planning in Black neighborhoods, thinking about putting literal Black individuals, they don't even have to be organizations, right? Black sole proprietors on your proposal's org chart, so that they can be a part of the process, but not in an ornamental way. So they can be resourced to support you in that work and to share their connections, their pre-existing connections to community with you. I also think that it's important to reflect on why your organization and why your circle of practice, your community of practice is predominantly white. Now, I am not one that thinks if everyone is white, there's inherently a problem. Yeah, I don't think that. But I think that if you are a predominantly white organization working in a space with the goal of improving the lived condition of Black folks, then there's a problem, right? So if you're going to pick the banner up, then it's important to not be the only ones holding that banner. And then lastly, what I'll say is what I usually say to city planners is make sure that your relationships with community are not transactional. So don't just show up when there's a campaign that you need support boosting, or when you want to get feedback, or walk audit or charrette or something. Those relationships should already be in place. You should be constantly working to build them just for the purpose of being in community. And then maybe you do get a seat at a table where someone asks you, like people to judge, or someone asks you what we should do, then your response is informed by genuine and authentic relationships at the community level, and not, hold on, let me reach out to the NAACP real quick.
That's one of my favorites. Yeah, let's just reach out to the, hey, come on, y'all. I know you're going to help me out. Help us out this pickle. Come on.
Yeah.
I mean,
or the church. We'll host it at the church, and that will solve for our failure to properly engage people.
Oh my God. Yeah. That's why I really, appreciated my role when I did, work in transit, and, having the familiarity with the very communities that I was trying to, help, provide these equitable outcomes. And I felt like a real bridge. And so diversity, I would say, has to be a priority if you truly intend to be of benefit to all. If you truly intend for that, your organization should reflect the diversity of the area that you're serving. It really should. I just throwing that out there.
Yeah, ideological diversity is important too, because Black folks are not a monolith, and actually there are plenty of problematic Black folks walking around who will sit at your diversity and inclusion effort and do very little to serve the interests of people who really need them to show up in a more meaningful way. So not just doing a scan of what you think are cultural markers on people's bodies, but making sure there's ideological diversity as well. And also diversity in terms of ability, like physical ability, disability, sexuality, of course, economic diversity. All those things need to be diverse, not just, we got the Black girl, so we're good.
Right. Avoid the complete tokenism approach.
And non-white people are not people of color. Just want to point that out too.
Boom. Got another one for you, and I think we're getting close to. Oh no, we got a little more time. Yeah. So I'm curious to hear any further comments about evolving carelessness being associated with poverty, and any other examples of how bicycle culture has been embraced in movements such as scrapper bikes in Oakland, in contrast with vehicles as status symbols.
Give me the beginning half again. Carlessness.
Yeah. Carlessness being associated with poverty.
So I don't know, I should have looked this up. I don't know what the state of Colorado's metric is for describing what people have been calling priority populations. But in California, we use the CalEnviro screen. And the CalEnviro screen generates an aggregated score based on several factors that somebody decided meant that this community was more prone to disparity and should be prioritized in our investment efforts, right? So of course, actual environmental factors are included, like air quality and pollution and GHG emissions. But one of the categories that has always been odd to me is this household does not have access to a vehicle. And so they would get more points on the how much poverty are you in scale, would get more points simply because their home is carless. And there's a contradiction, I think, that shows up between our data and how we describe who is in need, and what we're saying our values are as a field, right? So on these conferences like this, we're talking about car bans and getting more people to ride bikes. But when we describe Black communities in planning documents, we literally say that they are more poor, less educated, and have less access to jobs because they don't have a car. And while I understand the rationale that goes into defining households in that way, there's so much distance between our call to action as a field, right? Get out of your car, and the disparities that the data we use to talk about these communities lift up if and when a home is carless. And so I think, one, I would caution people from looking at a group like the Scraper Bikes as a movement, so to speak. I'm from Oakland, California, and we've been using Scraper Bikes since before y'all were talking about banning cars, okay? And actually, we've been getting arrested for them. So I'm not sure that folks recognize that this conversation is circular. The assumption that Black folks hate bike lanes and hate bikes is a false one. Even that assumption is often made about me. What I hate and cannot stand is our planning process for bicycling infrastructure, right? And I am very principled, so am someone who will literally not be seen on a bike until the laws that govern us, like our bicycle code, reflect the type of safety and security and resources that myself and people who look like me need when we're using a bike, right? And I would ask people to go look up the story of Dijon Kizzy in South Central LA, who in 2020 was shot in his back while riding a bike. And although that police officer's narrative has changed many times since the incident, the original police report lists that Dijon was in violation of the bicycle code, and that was the reason for the pursuit, right? I didn't even know we had a bicycle code.
Mm.
So until we get to a point where this isn't happening, as much as I love bikes, I won't be a part of bicycling culture.
Wow. Oh, that's intense. Got another one for you, and we'll do about two more, because we got about 6 minutes.
And I want to drink my coffee.
Well, go ahead, give it a sip. It's a long one anyway. Denver City Council just passed a group living amendment last night to allow for more unrelated adults to live together and expand where residential care facilities can operate. How can we collaborate across sectors and ensure that housing policy also supports equitable transportation options and communities staying in place with infrastructure projects? And can you speak to the comment about single family housing?
Yeah, that's great. I didn't know that they just passed that. That's actually, when we think about the defund police movement and the effort to end mass incarceration, what a lot of folks don't think about enough is how institutionalization also happens in these residential care facilities where people are forced to live. And so hearing that we're adopting more of a kinship care structure, it sounds like in some places, is exciting to me and a step in the right direction for sure. because I haven't read that policy, I can't speak to it in an intelligent way. But I imagine that other public housing programs, right, like Section 8, like, living projects, public, what do they call them? They call it public housing.
Public housing.
They still restrict, for example, single mothers from having a man living in the home with them, right? They still restrict elders who are receiving benefits like Section 8, maybe some supplemental income, from having young folks live with them. And I think, especially for Black and Brown folks, and Southeast Asian folks, shout out to Southeast Asian folks. My kinship caregiver was Southeast Asian growing up. So that's why I love dumplings so much. But what was I talking about? So culturally for us, it's a badge of honor and something we strive toward, to be able to get to a point where our home can house many generations or multiple generations at one time. I'm personally am working toward buying a home where my mother can live with me, right? And so I think, tying this to my comment about single family housing, the issue is we have had to be ingenuitive. We, meaning people of color, Black and Brown folks, have had to be creative with the circumstances that we've been given in this country for hundreds of years, right? Thinking about that spectrum again. And so what is a single family home to folks who live life with a lot of privilege and in luxury? The structure itself does not serve the same function for a Black family or Brown family, which is already, for all intents and purposes, practicing a density model by having multiple generations under one roof. And so our transition away from single family housing to mixed zoning and density and things like that has to take into consideration the ways single family homes structures have become a part of our culture that is not easily supplemented in an apartment building, and I think that, transit-oriented development is great, but we don't have enough Black developers, so I don't trust it. That's the simplest way I could say that. I also think that, I say this often, and maybe the next keynote I give, I'll actually share the map, but you can literally map our countries, our nations, populations of displaced communities along transit lines, transit routes in this country. So we need to explore what is happening in communities when we introduce new train stations, especially if the motivation for those train stations is to improve access for the Amazon headquarters employees or the Twitter headquarters employees. Because what happens when people are pushed out of their homes is not what people think. You don't just move across town to another apartment. That's expensive to do. I just spent a lot of money on moving. So it's expensive to do. Not everyone can do that. And when people are displaced, naturally, you're not gonna go pitch a tent in some neighborhood you've never been in. You stay in your community. You wanna stay in place. And so those folks who live under overpasses and who are camped out right next to these train stations are people who have stakeholdership in these communities too. So our transit-oriented development needs to include a dignified housing solution for the people who will be pushed out without it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that one. And we want to, I think, leave people with an action item or a path to action. So your philosophy of, unurbanism and everything that you have talked about, this entire morning is powerful and transformative. And how would you recommend that people begin that transformation for themselves? Like, what can be that first step?
I have a really easy way for people to do this. You can attend the Unurbanist Assembly. on June 18th of this year. We do it every year. We bring in Juneteenth through a 23-hour long digital virtual teach-in where we practice the art of being an urbanist through many ways. You can sign up for that at unurbanist.com. I think today what you can do though, one small gesture, not small, but one action you can take is to question something that up until today you thought was the right thing or the normal thing to do. Just ask more questions, challenge people. Even if you agree with someone's position, you would be surprised why that's their position. If you ask them, right? And so sometimes we become agents of a legacy of harm without knowing because we agree with the desired outcome. I agree with recreational activities, having access to them. I love bikes. I love being outdoors. I can't be an agent though of the system that means I'm more likely to die if I'm on a bike, right? So question some of the things that you are championing, not to get rid of them or to divorce those notions, but to make them be in service of people who rightfully are looking for atonement and reparations in this moment. We're not going to stop asking for reparations though. So folks need to reckon with that too. We might as well start on that before that price is going up as we speak.
Yeah. I thought you was gonna tell them to run the jewels, but no, I'm joking. Run my check. No, I'm joking. But hey, thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, and thank you to the audience and everyone for submitting some amazing questions and for this amazing conversation. I hope that it was insightful for you all. I hope that you walked away with a deeper understanding of your neighbors. I mean, we, Black people are your neighbors that are living a pretty different experience. And I hope that this was a great insight into that. Thank you, Pete, for inviting us and putting this together. This is an amazing event, and I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're at the close of a great session. I'll just echo what Mike said. Really appreciate everybody's engagement in the chat today and all of the thoughtful questions. That was just great to see. So it's my privilege to close out and to say on behalf of Bicycle Colorado and our audience today, thank you so much to Dr. Thomas, to Mr. Washington. It was an honor to host you. And thank you for bringing home the concepts of race reckoning and all the intersections with mobility policy and making it real. If you want to follow Dr. Thomas's work, you can get on the Thrivance Group website. It is thrivancegroup.com. You can also follow her on Twitter. She has one of the coolest Twitter handles in the history of the world. It's Dr. Des the Planner, which is DRDES, the Planner. So at Dr. Des the Planner. This morning after the session, we're going to send out a copy of today's slides. We will also send you links to the storyteller video with Amar Esusena Sid, so you can see the full video. And you'll also get a link to a recording of the session. I want to thank our series sponsor, Lyft, and our session sponsor, St. Joseph's Hospital. And it wouldn't be a Bicycle Colorado session if we didn't just briefly tempt you with bikes. So this is just a quick hit to let you know that if you want to support the work we do, and Jack, I think you need to shift us over to the next slide. A great way to do it will be to enter our February bike raffle. We are offering an Atlas Carbon road bike from Alchemy Bikes and Electra Townie 7D from Campus Cycles, and the raffle runs through March the 1st. And finally, I'm just going to close out and remind everybody to tune in for tonight's session. It is on redefining safety in Colorado's transportation system. It'll be tonight at 5:30 p.m. Again, it's redefining safety on Colorado's transportation system. So thanks everybody for a great session. Thanks for participating, and we hope to see you tonight.